All right, everyone. Today is the last day of the chapter, so this video is going to cover section 4.8, day 2. And so we're going to still be working with functions, but today we're going to talk about function notation and how we actually evaluate functions. And you're actually going to find that you've done this before, we just called it something different. So function notation, all that means is we're using the notation f of x, we say that f of x, in place of y. So for instance, where before we might have said y equals 3x plus 2, now we're just going to say instead of y, we're going to say f of x equals 3x plus 2. And all that's saying is that we have some function in terms of x, and you'll notice this matches the variable that's in our function. So that's all function notation is. It doesn't change anything about how we create tables at all. It's just a different notation. So let's look at our first set of examples here. We're going to evaluate a function to complete a table. So it tells us that our function is defined by this rule. Again, it's what we would have seen before, except we would have said y equals 5x minus 1. So now we need to complete the function table. So if my x is negative 1, all it means by g of x is that I'm finding g of negative 1 because my x value is negative 1. And so to evaluate, all I'm going to do is plug in negative 1 into my rule. So instead of x, if I'm finding g of negative 1, I'm going to plug in a negative 1 wherever I see x. And so if I do that, 5 times negative 1 is a negative 5, minus 1 gives me a negative 6. And I'm going to do the same thing for the whole table. So now I want g of 0. Again, I'm going to replace x with 0. I'm going to plug in a 0, and when I evaluate that, I'm going to get a negative 1 out. And so I'm going to do that for the rest of the table. G of 1 is 5 times 1 minus 1, which is going to give me 4. G of 2 is 5 times 2 minus 1, which is 9. And G of 5 is just 5 times 5 minus 1, or 25 minus 1, which is 24. And so that's how we're going to fill out a table using a function. Again, it's just the same as how we created our tables before. The notation is just a little bit different. So the only thing different now in part B is that I have a negative coefficient. That's really the major difference here. But again, how I fill out my table does not change. If I have x is negative 1, I know f of negative 1 is going to be negative 3 times negative 1 plus 3. So negative times a negative, that's a positive 3 plus 3 gives me a positive 6. Okay, I'm just going to do 2 more values in the table and then we'll move on. So for 0, if I want to find f of 0, it means now plug in 0 wherever I have x. So negative 3 times 0 plus 3. This is just 0, so 0 plus 3 gives me 3. And the last one we'll do is f of 1 is negative 3 times 1 plus 3. So I have a negative 3 plus 3 is going to give me 0. Now, the last piece of this, then, is just evaluating functions. So this gives me 2 functions, f and g, and it asks me to find f of negative 4 and g of 3. Again, this is just doing what we were doing in the table. If I want to find f of negative 4, all that's telling me to do is wherever I see x in my original function, I'm going to replace that x with a negative 4. So now I'm going to take 2. My x is going to get replaced with a negative 4 minus 1. And so negative 4 times 2 is a negative 8 minus 1 is a negative 9. So f of negative 4 is equal to negative 9. Same thing with our function g. If I have g of 3, wherever I see an x in my function g, I'm going to replace that with 3. So now I have negative 2. I'm going to be really careful with parentheses here because I know I need to square that x value. And again, for my input here, I'm going to replace x with 3. So now you can use your calculator to do that. But if I do 3 squared is 9 times a negative 2 is negative 18. Minus 3 is a negative 21. And so those are my two function values. Okay, same thing here. Now I have two new functions. Again, f of 4 says wherever you saw x in your original equation, we're going to replace it with 4. So now I have negative 3 times 4 is a negative 12, minus 3 is a negative 15. For g of negative 3, I have negative 2. Again, I have to be careful with parentheses because my x value is going to be cubed. Then I subtract 5. I'm plugging in a negative 3 here. And again, be careful when you enter this that you're using parentheses appropriately. So I should have negative 2. I'm going to do parentheses negative 3. That's cubed. And then I have minus 5. And so that should give me a positive 49 for that function value. So those are the only two types of problems you need to be able to do for this section. So like we usually do, go ahead and pause the video. And then when you unpause it, you can check your solutions against mine. Alright, so here are the answers to those two problems. Again, make sure that all your signs are correct and you've been careful with your calculations. So now you'll have some time to practice that in the homework, and then we'll look at starting to review for the Chapter 4 test. Good luck!